I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life, my weekly podcast, Stories from Our Lives.
Season 4, Chapter 5.
The Principles of War.
Principles of war?
Principles of War. News coverage of the war has no shortage of experts. I'm not sure how much actual expertise there is, but certainly a lot of experts, a whole army of them. These are opinion people, and don't get me wrong, their views are valued, but they are opinions. They are not news. The real experts aren't on TV blathering about the topic du jour. They are most likely behind the scenes working on a solution. As I said, views are valued. We just shouldn't confuse the news with the views. Don't confuse the news with the views. Ooh, I should have a t-shirt made. Recently, though, one expert referred to the principles of war. I perked up. There's principles of war? Well, of course there are. War is a time-honored human tradition. It only makes sense that military strategists would have dissected it over time to see what works and what doesn't. I wanted to know more about the principles of war and compare these principles to the events of Putin's war, the attack on Ukraine. There are 10 principles of war, although sometimes listed as 9 principles of war. These are not to be confused with Sun Tzu's Art of War, although many of the principles are culled from his historic book. What I also found in comparing the lists is that there is no particular order to the principles. This isn't a do-it-yourself how-to guide. Step 1, load gun. Step 2, aim gun. Step 3, fire gun. No, it's not like that. So I'm going to go through the list to jump around a bit, and I also do not want this to be some dry lecture about battle principles. Like I said, just a comparison of the principles of war and how they might align with what Putin is doing. The first principle I will look at is surprise. This is a pretty easy one to understand, right? The element of surprise. It seems, at first blush, that Putin didn't have it. I mean, he'd been threatening and tipping his hand for weeks. But let me offer this. The infamous World War II German general, Waldemar Erfurth, he said 2 sides are required for surprise, those who are doing the surprising, and those who are willing to be surprised. The so-called West and the various Western alliances seemed to be willing to be surprised. There was all this debate, talk, as to whether or not Putin would do it. No, he'd never do it. Oh, yes, he might. Ukraine, meanwhile, has spent 30 years moving west, so to speak, distancing itself from kleptocratic Russia, declaring their desire to officially be a part of Europe, applying to NATO. The Western world hemmed and hawed, sat on their hands, and now here we are. There's the UN, the EU, the European Commission, the Brexited UK, NATO, the G20, the G7, and so forth, saying, and in some cases doing, the right things, but only after the missiles landed in Ukraine. Surprise! The second principle of war I'll raise is offensive action, or offense. Not going to spend a lot of time on this one, it's self-explanatory. War is when all else fails. And this principle basically says offense. Strike first. Next, if you want to have a really good war, is concentration of force. You can't take it all at once. So you use your resources wisely, one battle at a time. Putin's initial strategy seemed to be Kyiv, capital city, cut off the head, as it's been called. This has proved tougher than he thought. Ukraine is the 45th largest country in the world by landmass, but it's not small. It's the size of Alberta, or Texas if that helps. It's too big to just run over, so concentration of force would be required. Next principle, again, somewhat random order, economy of effort. Also pretty self-explanatory. Use what you have in the most efficient way possible. Manage resources. Try to be in the right place at the right time. Little evidence of this from Putin's army so far. And a footnote on resources. There's no arguing that the Russian military is a mighty force, but maybe not as mighty as we thought. Maybe there's a reason Russia was fond of staging those big military parades, while the rest of the world had Santa Claus parades. Maybe those big Ruski military parades were more show power than blow power. Another principle, selection and maintenance of aim. Obviously, occupation and control of Ukraine is the overall aim. But this principle refers to particular aims in the war itself. This city, this strategic location, and so forth. Once you pick your fight, can you maintain it? In the first week, failing grade on this principle for Putin, which leads us right to our next principle. Flexibility. Can you change on the fly and do so effectively? If Russian ground forces aren't advancing, would you call scatterbombing being flexible, or is it just panicking? There's also security. One would think this would be Putin's strength. Given his background, KGB, you have to secure the intelligence and trust it. Any spoils of war not only have to be taken but secured, which requires the reassignment of your resources, including personnel. Otherwise, those things just might be taken back when you're not looking. This leads us to the principle of sustainability. In other words, you have to be prepared to be in this for the long run. And that's even when the shelling stops. You have to have the physical, financial, and moral sustainability to not only succeed in the war, but continue to control things long afterward. Did Putin just misjudge this one big time? It seems so. Physically and financially, he has been cut off from the rest of the world. Rumor was that he had built up a big war chest. Also that he had untold personal wealth. Plus, he made a deal with China. All right, but the rest of the world has cut him off. Him and all Russians, even those not even living in Russia. Russian economy has been put in a downward tailspin. The ruble worth nada. Hyperinflation coming up for all citizens. Putin's war is not sustainable. Russia needs China, but China? After a while, they got to be saying, geez, Russian friendship, who needs that hassle? And let's say, for example, that Putin succeeds by some warped definition in his mind, that he takes Kyiv, that he puts in a puppet government. Does that mean that this is all over? That Ukrainians just throw their arms up in the air and say, oh, well, we lost that one. What's for dinner? Not a chance. This is a fight for the future, for the ages. Putin either didn't think of that or doesn't care. A key principle of war is cooperation. This does not apply as much to Russia in this case as it does to Ukraine, in my opinion. A prime example of this principle would be the Allied forces in World War II. A cooperation and coordination was needed of governments, generals, rivalries within militaries, etc. All would have to come together for things like D-Day to work. In this war, there is only one aggressor, Russia. Cooperation might be the challenge for Ukraine. And by that I mean you have the Ukrainian military forces, but you also have citizens grabbing rifles and marauding groups of startup paramilitaries trying to defend their country by defending the street they live on. And what if others step in, be they individual nations or NATO? The cooperation principle would really then have to come into play. And this perfectly introduces the final principle of war: morale. In war, you must defeat and deflate the morale of the enemy, while maintaining the positive morale of your people and your forces. This was a giant miscalculation by Putin. Who knows why? Perhaps because he's become more isolated lately. He has cut down his inner circle to only a select few. Or he's just a madman. He definitely underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people. Perhaps morale is not high among Ukrainians, but anger and defiance are. If one definition of morale is focus of spirits, that is very high right now. Even those tear-filled interviews with Ukrainian refugees crossing into Poland, Romania, et al. Show a heart broken, but a will with a very tough and impenetrable veneer. What is the morale of the Russian army or Russian citizens, do you think? It cannot be very good right now. Let me ask you this. What country has the largest population of Ukrainian diaspora in the world? Here's a hint. Canada is second. First is Russia. A lot of Ukrainians live in Russia. A lot of Russians live in Ukraine. Your demagogue, self-anointed 21st century king just told you to go out and kill your brother. And not only that, it's not going well. This is not why a lot of people signed up for the Russian army. They signed up for a paycheck, not to go kill Ukrainians. This is not the unified Russian army driving back the Nazis in World War II. This is an army told to go destroy a neighbor you've peacefully coexisted with for the last 30 years. And, in a sense, before that, for the latter half of the 20th century's USSR. And what about the Russian civilians? In the first week of the war, 1,000 a day were arrested in Russia for demonstrating against the war. Russian TV and media not even allowed to report on that. Yeah, but the word gets out. What happens when it's 1,000 more? Or 10,000? Or 1,000,000 people suddenly show up at the Kremlin? Maybe they'll park their trucks and protest. Then what? Can you arrest them all? Hey, Army, when you're done in the Ukraine, come downtown, there's a shootout. What happens when Russians can't find any bread on the grocery shelves? And when they do, it's $300 a loaf. How long before the next revolution? Vladdy the Baddie already lost the morale battle. Of the 10 principles of war, surprise, offense, concentration, economy, maintenance, flexibility, security, sustainability, cooperation, and morale, the highfalutin Putin has failed in 9 out of 10. The only one he had was surprise, and only because the West kind of handed it to him. And of course, that's now long gone. The history of Russia, as many of us have known it, is only about 100 years old. There were about 300 years of imperial Tsarist rule by the Romanovs, and Nicholas II abdicated the Russian throne in 1917. Briefly afterward, Bolsheviks, communists, Lenin, Stalin, and names some of us might even remember, like Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and others. The current mad monk of Moscow, Vlad Putin, should be barely a blip in that history. He's somewhere between a czar and a people's commissar, at least in his own mind. I'll tell you what he is not: a general. His Russian military history is spy. How many spies make good generals? None. This is a failed war, and its resolution not only requires Putin to retreat, but to go away, to be gone entirely by whatever means it takes. Notice that the West didn't just jump into the war immediately to defend Ukraine. No boots on the ground, rockets red glare kind of thing. But they are building the case for that. Don't know how long that will take, or even if it'll be an eventuality. Biden and other individual leaders of nations saying they wouldn't send in troops, but they didn't say anything about agents. Don't you think a lot of those are in Ukraine already? Yeah, no boots on the ground, but probably plenty of dress shoes. When will enough be enough? Again, for Ukraine, that moment has come and gone. The will of the Ukrainian people has been held up as an example for the rest of the world. Their determination is admirable. Whether they stay prepared to die for their country or escape to a democratic nation in order to live for their family, both require outstanding bravery. The president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has been called Churchillian in his leadership. When I first heard that, I decided to read a little bit more about Winston Churchill. Here's something I found we should think about. Churchill said that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Spot the bodyguards, salute the truth.
Later That Same Life is written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. Larry Fedoruk, 37 at gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.